Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. This episode, I have Chris Ferguson. Chris is a clinical psychologist, professor, and researcher. He's also the author of two books. The first one, Moral Combat: Why the War on Violent Video Games is Wrong. And his most recent book, How Madness Shaped History: An Eccentric Array of Maniacal Rulers, Raving Narcissists, and Psychotic Visionaries. Chris is a wonderful guy. We got on very well together in this conversation, and we talked about a whole bunch of things. I can't get Chris on the podcast and not talk about video games, and then we talk about his new book. So we started the conversation talking about how he got into video game research. Usually when people, get their PhD in psychology, they're not, there's no specialization for video game research. So we talk about how he got into this type of work and some of his interesting research that he's been doing for the past 15, 20 years on it. We talk about the standard view of violent mass media, which includes video games, and how for a long time people thought that was what made one prone to violent behaviors. We talk about how reward-based video games are less common and don't translate into society. We talk about the flaws with the catharsis argument. And then we talk about what the most current literature says about violence in mass media and social behavior, which is a lot of the work that he's done, which is, as you can imagine, different from how most people thought about violence and violent films and video games and things like that. We kind of wrap this section up on the conversation with talking about some of the practical elements of kids playing these games in terms of content and time. We then shift gears and we talk about his new book, which has been out for I think about a year now. So we talk about why he chose to write the new book, what his main thesis is of looking at historical events through the psychological profile of leaders and why that matters, as opposed to just looking at environmental context or things of that nature. We talk about the differences between insanity, madness, and mental illness. We give a kind of overview of the history of institutionalization and de-institutionalization. We talk about some of the challenges with diagnostic criteria in general. So, for example, we have a bit in there about conduct disorder versus antisocial personality disorder, etc. We also give a delineation between psychopathy and sociopathy and some of the differences. And we talk about some of the elements of diagnosing from afar or with historical figures, and then some of the progressive changes in society at the moment. Chris is a wonderful, brilliant, affable guy. I really enjoyed talking with him. We got on, again, well together, and just so much to learn from him on all of his great research. So now I bring you Chris Ferguson. I am here with Chris Ferguson. Chris, thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me today. This is awesome. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm also been looking forward to chatting with you. So why don't you tell listeners a little bit about yourself, say kind of your background, your expertise, what you've written, what you currently research, all that good stuff.
Yeah, sure. Good question. Who am I? I don't know. So I'm a professor of psychology at Stetson University, which is down in, it's near Orlando, Florida. It's about 45 minutes outside of Orlando, which is the best city in the world to live in. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I mostly do research on media and violence and related issues, anything from violent crime in general to violent media, violent video games, and of course other media effects like body image and 13 Reasons Why kind of stuff. And I'm also interested in, kind of the way like psychology and history, and I would include in that current events kind of overlap with each other. So I wrote this book, How Madness Shaped History, which really kind of started off as a book to write that was just kind of fun to write. Because I like all these kind of like sordid tales from history, these stories of horrible people that have done horrible things. So I really just kind of wanted to have an excuse to write a little bit about sort of history and psychology together.
Yeah.
And then it eventually morphed into towards the end, particularly it's kind of like talking about modern politics and how all these things that went wrong in history sort of are illustrative of some things that are going wrong today as well. So it ended up being a bit more related to current events than I think I meant it to be when I first started writing it, to be sure.
Yeah, no, yeah, and that, I'm sure we'll definitely talk about the book, which was great. I really enjoyed it. And what are you currently doing? Any current research or current things that you're doing at the moment, or?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's been a little weird, right? Since I've been mostly working from home, so
Right.
my wife is in a high risk category for COVID, so we're pretty, we've been pretty strict about the social distancing and that sort of
Sure.
stuff. So
Sure.
we don't see any human beings anymore for the most part. So it's kind of hard to do research that way. But I've been doing some stuff with sort of pre-existing data sets, which is and just some data that I've had laying around. We actually had one study that we had finished, thankfully, before COVID set in, that was using VR video games. And so it was just ended up being a nice time to sort of write that up and send it out. So I'm under review
Cool.
right now. And with the events that happened in the summer of 2020, I've also kind of gotten interested in this sort of this issue of like race and policing and the criminal justice system. And just kind of looking at some of those issues as well to see where some of the nuances and complexities might be in some of that data. So so I mean, I'm looking forward to getting back and actually in the lab and running participants in the lab. But a lot of what I've been doing more recently has been the sort of like either online survey type stuff or meta-analyses or just working with the data sets that I already had.
Yeah.
I did one with Dungeons and Dragons, which is also on review. Which is
cool. Very cool.
So we'll see
That's
where
super
that
cool.
one,
Yeah.
where any of these things land. So
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so let's start with video games. Now, video games are listeners probably don't know this, but I really enjoy video games. I know that's kind of like for some people a weird thing for like adult males like playing video games. Now, I don't play as much as I used to. Obviously, I'm terribly busy. But my daughter and I play, so I have a good excuse to play video games now. But yeah, I grew up with video games. I mean, Super Nintendo was probably my first system. I've played in Atari, but Super Nintendo was like my first.
Yeah.
My first love was probably Genesis. That was the first system I really loved, and I have had probably every major system since. I've always had one laying around or always had one at the house. I don't have a PS5 at the moment, which is incredibly frustrating.
Nobody does.
It's so frustrating because I do want one. It's so annoying. But yeah, so you wrote a book on video games. I think video games and violence, no?
Yeah.
Or looking at the data on that. So maybe just kind of set us up for how you got interested in video games, and do you play yourself, and what's your interest in it, and then we can start getting into some of the data on it.
Yeah. So getting involved in doing research on violence in video games was really all a big mistake. So it's it's actually been a really good mistake, but it really wasn't the plan at all. It's been I guess it's worked out pretty well in general. But I grew up with video games as well. I was in the Atari 2600 generation, so by the time I sort of became aware of the world around me in the late 70s and 80s, that there at very least were the cabinet games and arcades, which were awesome. And then the arcade culture is pretty much dead, but I still remember it quite fondly.
Are you one of those people that you can buy them now? People buy them and they buy like a Galaga or a Pac-Man and they just put it in their basement, and they don't put coins in it, but they still have the joystick and the buttons, and they have like the big whole thing, and then they just play at home. Some people do that.
I've never done, I know I haven't done that. I think that would be a hard sell for my wife. But, but I think my car, the Patrick Markey, I think he said he might have a cabinet. But I mean, you can play most of these games online for free.
Right,
but, so I don't know how much these cabinets run for. I don't figure like $1,000.
Yeah.
That's what you know what we really need, honey? We need cabinets.
People see it like a collector's thing. I think, it's just like one of those weird things where it's just like, yeah, I can play it on my phone, or I can download it on my Nintendo. but on my Switch. But I just want the old school kind of like stand up, and you just push the buttons, until they break, kind of thing. But
Yeah, it's like, yeah, we need a new AC machine, but nah, we're gonna get
nah,
the Wizard of War on a cabinet, so.
right.
Yeah, and then of course, we had eventually, I forget how old I was, somewhere in late elementary school. Finally, my parents, who were not extravagant people when it came, so we like never had cable, which was like one of the tragedies of my childhood. And I think I was probably a teenager when I finally begged them to get a VCR.
Mhm.
And same thing with the Atari 2600. I was kind of late to getting it, but we eventually did get one, and it was amazing.
Yeah,
It really was like revolutionary.
Right.
So yeah, I definitely grew up with it, and I think there is that kind of like hard cutoff of somewhere like around age 55 to 60 that people below that age kind of grew up with video games and sort of understand them and like them for the most part. I mean, you can find even some young people that will complain about video games, but for the most part,
Right.
there's kind of like generational divide that it's around 55 or 60. I'm almost 50,
Mhm.
50 in July.
Mhm.
So that gives you kind of, above that line,
Mhm.
people just loathe video games, and at that line or below, people are usually pretty okay with them.
Right.
No, in terms of like getting involved in like researching it was really, like I said, it wasn't my plan, and I think it actually was much better than what my plan would have been. I got involved in psychology like a lot of people do. A lot of my students will do the same thing because I love like serial killers and mass homicide perpetrators and all that, like really super deviant criminal stuff.
Right.
Which is probably the goofiest reason to get involved in psychology. Has nothing to do with helping people or learning
No, it's
yourself.
just it's all the worst
Really like
extreme
Silence of the Lambs,
fringe. Right. The worst forms of psychopathology. That's what's interesting.
Yeah. And I actually was doing research, in Orange County Corrections. Actually, when I was a graduate student, that was my dissertation. Was it's got like screening for mental illness in mental or in criminal justice populations. And my PhD program at UCF, University of Central Florida, they required us to take 2 classes outside the majors. It's almost like a minor. I don't know if they called it that, but it was only 2 classes. And I took both mine and criminal justice because, again, that was sort of my interest area. And the happened to be the second one that I'd taken with a professor still there named Stephen Holmes, who was sort of an expert in serial murder and sex crimes and all that kind of like hardcore stuff. He did it as a summer thing, and it was like guest lectures. So every week there were different people that would come in and talk about things. And he had one particular guest speaker in criminology for the University of Central Florida, University of South Florida, excuse me, come in. And she happened to mention, I think she had read, it was one of these articles that was in American Psychologist by, Bushman and Anderson, going way back, like, I don't know, 2000, 2001, somewhere around there. And she kind of repeated like the lines from it, essentially saying like, there's no more debate on media violence causing aggressions, solved. And it's the same as smoking and lung cancer and this kind of stuff. I've written her since. I mean, like maybe like 5 or 10 years ago, I just got like, hey, you remember? She actually was like really, really cool about it. No, she was fantastic. She was like, cool. Oh yeah, I would just repeat what I heard. I just, and I wasn't like, rubbing it in or anything. I was just like, hey, I just thought you'd be curious to know. Like, I went on this whole like career trajectory. And it was you that made me do it. I think literally, if I hadn't heard that talk, and of course, there's a certain like butterfly effect here. If the people that Bushman Anderson had written it hadn't written their article the way they did, and then if she hadn't repeated it, while I happened to be there in a class I may or may not have taken, it wasn't even in psychology. That I probably would have stuck with more criminal justice populations, which are much harder to work with, because it's harder to get into those, settings. That's why I say it was probably good that I just shifted over to video games. Much easier to have people go in the lab and play video games. But that was it. It was a mistake. I mean, I guess it was just it was a mistake, but it was a series of
accidents.
Yeah, it really was a synchronicity sort of thing. And my reaction was kind of like, I was enough in criminology that, criminologists tend to be pretty, I mean, you can find some hyperbolic criminologists, don't get me wrong, but, they tend to be a little bit careful about, this is a risk factor, not a cause. These are small effects, crime is complicated. And to hear like this sort of smoking and lung cancer thing was, that it was pretty startling. And that's the kind of like my personality, which in some ways good, and in some ways probably a serious flaw. is like the more I'm told that something is absolutely true, the less I believe it. And so it always makes me kind of curious to dig into that area. So I did that with video games, and I got involved in the same thing with other areas like spanking research. I'm not an advocate for spanking at all, but I'm sort of curious about some of the hyperbolic claims, there, as well. So, and that's the kind of thing that sort of draws me in and attracts me. It's just kind of like, society gets really, really, I don't know if excited is the right word, because it could be quite negative actually, but really, really alarmed maybe is a better word about something, and they think this thing is absolutely true, and then I'm sort of curious what the data is to suggest that thing is actually true. And occasionally it might be, but in most cases it is not. So, or at least things are more nuanced and more complicated than perhaps the narrative that emerges either from the scholars who study it and then into the news media and into public consciousness. So that's kind of how I got wrapped up into it. But yeah, it's actually been kind of cool because I've, universities have bought me PlayStations and Xboxes, and so that's all.
But you can't get a pre-order to a PS5 though. They haven't.
I still can't get. I can't get. So I think what we're gonna do, because I have a certain pool of money, not very much, like $800, something like that, and and we have to spend it by July, and I'm not going to travel anywhere, so I gotta. I guess spend enough for PlayStation 5, but it's hard to get them, right? So
they're hard to get. They're hard to get.
Either we're gonna just bite the bullet and get it on eBay,
right? Yeah.
Or I'll just try to. I have a friend who works at Target, not near here, unfortunately, but he might be able to figure out when the local stores get their shipments, and I'll just be at 6 a.m. like out there, bang on the door, and just get reimbursed.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll figure it out.
Yeah. So maybe give us the kind of in that lecture that you heard, and which is how when I was in grad school I kind of heard kind of something similar, probably, is kind of give us the standard view of what's the correlation or correlatory values between violence and video games.
Yeah, well, I think if you ask like the average psychologist or criminologist or communications researcher today, you'd probably get a much more nuanced answer than you would have 20 years ago. So, and of course the APA still has has never budged from their standard position, but that's a whole other story. So they have a lot of issues. But certainly 15, 20 years ago, if you'd asked, again, that would have been the standard line. Like, there's no doubt whatsoever that there's a link between video games and other media violence, and no doubt.
Very definitive. If I'm playing Grand Theft Auto, Vice City, I'm going to go and, I'm more likely to have symptoms of oppositional defiant disorder, or I'm going to have, truancy issues or behavioral issues in school, et cetera, other things of juvenile disturbances or behavioral disturbances as a linked cause, or not causation, but some kind of correlatory link between playing a lot of aggressive video games where you're killing and shooting and robbing and destroying things, and or maybe I guess that branches out and talks about mass media in terms of certain films you watch or television shows, etc. This has a strong correlatory impact on pretty deviant behavior in adolescents. That's what's the standard view.
Yeah, I think they would have said it was causal. I mean, I think I know they would have said it was causal. So it's not, So they certainly wouldn't have even hedged on the correlation. And I think the standard line was the sense of like it affects everybody. Now some people might be more affected than others, but even so you might say, well, maybe someone who has a pre-existing problem with aggression might be more impacted than say you or I. We're sort of assuming that you and I don't have pre-existing problems with aggression, but but assuming peaceful people, like hopefully we are, might be affected less, but we're still affected. And we're maybe more likely to snap at our spouse or or I don't know, say something snarky on the internet or whatever. It might not be violence, but nonetheless, the effects would be there. And also the, sort of like the graphicness. Now the general public tend to be obsessed with graphicness, so they look at like Grand Theft Auto and it's offensive, so, well, it's not, to a lot of people it's offensive, And so they kind of focus on that, the blood, the gore, the other
So
elements.
kind of Resident Evil type of games, or Doom games.
Yeah.
There's certain games where there's, just graphic.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the old school Doom looks pretty silly,
Yeah.
It's, it's hard to imagine that one was, this is the thing that's like making people like school shooters and stuff. But I get it. But that's also the point. If like, the graphics really didn't matter to the theory, it really was the sort of sense of like whether you were playing Pac-Man or Grand Theft Auto 5, as long as you could kind of say that these were like quote unquote violent video games. And I know that probably sounds absurd to a lot of your readers or listeners to think that Pac-Man's a violent video, but technically according to the definition, I mean, you're eating the ghosts are eating you, and the Minecraft, would be a violent video game. Angry Birds, any of these things would be, theoretically, which means it's a really weird concept, but,
right.
But it's just the idea that you're rehearsing the aggression over and over and over again is going to make you more likely, like you're kind of like a programmed machine, more or less, that the more you do something in a fictional universe and the more likely you are to do it in real life. And in fact, you even will get, statements made by some of these individuals who are advocates for this, that, if being beaten as a child would cause you to become more aggressive, why wouldn't playing a violent video game also, make you more aggressive? There's no theoretical difference between, again, I'm not endorsing this belief, but there's no theoretical difference between, sort of exposure to violence in real life versus violence in most people think this is incredibly absurd, but that's kind of how the theory evolved, more or less.
And so the idea was that, that you're in the fictional kind of space of a video game, you're able to act out on certain, violent actions, and then you're behaviorally you're rewarded for that, right? You get points, or you get certain items, or depending on the game. And so there was some kind of link there, was like, I'm being rewarded for doing some type of, at least even if in a broad definition, aggressive behavior in a simulated kind of reality, if you will. So that will just kind of click on in real life, and you driving your car, and you're going to cut someone off, and you'll be rewarded somehow, or someone does something to you in the grocery store, and you tell them to go fuck themselves, like that's what it was in the game. And so I'm just kind of I've been reinforced for that. That was sort of the kind of link there, or of how it
trends. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I can't remember the last game I played that I actually was given points for anything. I mean, I'm sure there are still some games out there that do that. Like some of the app games still do that. But I mean, obviously you still get like achievements and other, sorts of things in the games that you could say are fairly synonymous with it. But I'm not sure that that's the major draw. If you kind of look at the old school, like 80s game. Yeah, they just like gave you points for stuff, and that was much more direct and much more simplistic. But that kind of started, going away in the 90s. To a large degree, but that was the idea, that you're sort of being reinforced for these behaviors, and you still hear this kind of sense of, some of it is like with people that obviously haven't played the game. So you hear people talk about like Grand Theft Auto 5 and say like, you can like hire a prostitute, and then you get in your car and you run her over and you grab your money back, so you're getting paid, Yeah, but in the game it's like $11, which is nothing. In the it's not. Having played the game, it's a disincentive to get out of your car to pick up $11. It's just not going to add to your stash in any meaningful way. But again, I think that's where sometimes people have this very primitive vision of rewards and punishments, and how, again, it's a very mechanistic view of how people work. And of course, I'm not saying we don't respond to rewards and punishments. We do, of course.
Right.
But this idea that you're playing Space Invaders and you got a high score there, and then you think you're going to go to school and you can shoot everybody up, and then you're going to get rewarded for this. That is, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding about how human psychology works. To think that these things are parallel, or to think that people, even people with serious mental illnesses, view these things as being parallel. I think that's quite uncommon.
Even so yes, I've heard that as well, about the kind of this very mechanistic kind of way of viewing, rewards, punishments. But even like another argument for this kind of traditional standard view, which obviously is not the case anymore, which was something along the lines of, well, it was a type of catharsis that people could act out their aggression. they were able to, they had all this stuff going on at school, or they were being bullied, or tough home life, and they, plug in, and, even if they're playing like Tomb Raider, they're shooting people and they're dying and they just respawn, and et cetera, et cetera. But there was this way of this, like, kind of almost cathartic way of, like, well, they're just acting out their anger that they can't act out with other people, and that's too, not reinforcing, but that's putting them in a kind of a negative space. And so now they're just walking around out in life where they're just like, yes, I need to, like, exercise my demons of, all this, aggression or whatever.
Yeah.
Those were some other claims as well. No. And what were some of the other, like, reasonings with the, standard traditional view of violence, from video games?
Well, that was kind of like, the idea of catharsis was in some ways kind of like the opposite of the Soka modeling. Yeah, so the idea is that you would be angry because you had a bad day, and then you come and, you would play a video game. And the idea was, what people saw as a mistake with the idea of catharsis, which really was more popular like in the 60s. And so it kind of like went out of fashion. And I use that word choice very specifically in the 70s and 80s. Is that you had to experience the emotion, right? So with the idea is, if you're angry because you had a bad day at work or school, you come home, you play a video game that makes you angrier. That's the key of catharsis, but it allows you to experience that anger in a safe area. So again, you can shoot a bunch of things, and then eventually you sort of burn the anger out of it. That's always been something of a controversial idea. I'm not sure that's really what happens with video games, for the most part. We actually did one study a few years ago. So catharsis really, like I said, did fall out of favor. And a lot of these people who kind of advocated for media violence really were pretty hostile to the idea of catharsis. And in a way, I think that maybe did the theory of catharsis a little bit of an injustice. And we actually did a study a few years ago that we basically stressed people out in a minor way. Obviously, we didn't tell them their mother died or anything, but it was irritated them, and then randomized them into several different conditions. And one was they were given some sort of like filler task that, they had to do something, like, I forget what it was, but it might've been like fill out very simple math questions for like 15 to 20 minutes. And then the second group actually, did get a bobo dow to beat the crap out of, which is kind of like your like stereotypical like cathartic activity, right? Is to be angrier at something else to sort of burn it out. And then the third group was a little bit more complicated. So there's really multiple groups, but there was like of that third group, half of them were assigned to a certain activity to do, like a violent video game or something of that sort to play. And then the rest were actually allowed to choose an activity. So they were given a list of like 6 different things. It was everything from sit in the dark with the lights off, to listen to music, to playing a video game. So they were given a choice of a bunch of different things. And so what it turns out is the worst thing in terms of like anger or irritation, the worst thing is to do nothing. So if you give people nothing to do, then they tend to be still irritated, at the end of whatever it was, at 15, 20 minutes. The cathartic activity actually worked better than nothing, so it seems like, for a while, the thinking was that catharsis made things worse. It actually, at least in our study, did not. The catharsis actually did make things better. But the people who were the best off were the ones who were allowed to choose an activity they enjoyed. So what seems to work better than catharsis, we might say catharsis is better than doing nothing, but better than catharsis is something we call mood management, which is probably what most people are doing with video games. What that means is that you come home and you have a bad day, whatever happened, and then you pick something will calm you down, will be fun. So the idea is not that video games, when you play like a violent video game, if you're a fan, if you enjoy these games, it's not that you're playing Call of Duty and getting angrier and that anger is then burning out. It's more like you're just having fun, and that fun is distracting you from whatever stressed you out. And that does seem to work. I mean, video games are pretty effective if you like video games. That's the key, so it's like any hobby. If you don't like it, it's not going to work. Right. It's like, knitting works for some people, but I'd end up in the emergency room. So knitting is not a thing that, would reduce my stress. So, it can be an effective stress reduction. And violent games and non-violent games both work, in that sense. There's nothing like impeding the stress reduction because the game is violent necessarily. So that's probably what's going on for most people, simply that they're engaging in a fun activity. And it doesn't matter if it's badminton or Call of Duty. It's as long as you're enjoying what you're doing, it's going to be be effective. But that wasn't the thinking. Of course, for many many years, it just was this was bad, and it was going to make things worse.
Yeah, there. If I there was a couple weeks ago. It was just a long week. It was a long week for me. It was a long week for my daughter,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like I think it was like a Friday evening or something, and I just said, I said, "What do you want to do?" She goes, "I just want to play Battlefront 2 for like an hour and a half." And I was like, "Yes, let's do it." So we play Star Wars Battlefront 2 and we just kill droids for like, an
Mm-hmm.
hour. And it was like, didn't think about anything else for the week. Didn't think about all the things I had to do. She forgot about all of her stuff she had to do for the week. And, we didn't, we didn't, we didn't think about that. We just, you know, kill droids.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. So it was very kind of like this kind of, almost like relaxing or in some ways, I think kind of like a healthy escape
Mm-hmm.
of sorts. And so I think that can be definitely, I would, kind of agree with that. So tell us then how it goes from, for a long time, people, kind of like you were saying, very definitively violent video games, Call of Duty, Resident Evil, whatever the game was, or, this is causing violence. How did that change and how did that become more nuanced to what the current standard way of thinking about video games and violence is now?
Yeah, I mean, I think like historically with most of these areas, people just kind of like jump on the bandwagon for a little while, and then it kind of dies off. So you kind of look at like the 1940s, there were some research papers on like the perils of radio, for instance, and then what happens is people just get bored with it. The old people that are afraid of the radio die, and then the audience goes away, and then scholars just stop writing about it anymore. And then the same thing with comic books in the 50s. And then with television, even, there was a pretty big pool of research looking at television violence. And then, here we are, we never hear of it anymore, or at least very, very rarely we hear about television violence. And what must happen in most of these situations is kind of like people get excited about this area for maybe a decade or two and just publish, particularly in the case of television, a couple hundred studies maybe.
Mhm.
And then just people lose interest, but nobody ever actually like exonerates television, right? So if you really like ask these guys, well, what do you think about television? Nobody talks about it anymore. Like they still will probably say, oh yeah, television's bad. We just don't do any research on it anymore because we solved that one. We fixed that one.
Right.
What happened with video
The
games?
next John Wick movie isn't going to make me want to go and like shoot a bunch of people out. It's not going to do that.
Yeah, you're not going to suddenly have this like hyper choreographed dance like martial arts, like thing where you kill like 100 people in a conveniently all glass building so that it shatters around.
Right. Yeah, somehow that's not going to look as cool, right? I'm just not as appealing to me all of a sudden.
I would trip and fall in the bushes on the way into the building.
Right.
But anyway, so I think what happened with video games, it was the first time really, I mean, some of these things you would get some pushback, but I think video games was the first one that actually had like a concerted pushback of scholars who kind of like, like in my own case, but I certainly wasn't the only one, was like, this sounds like really extreme, and then you would,
Mhm.
in my case, I started to read some of the articles, and I remember like one, and I'm picking on Anderson a little bit here, but it was one from like 2000, it was Anderson and Dill 2000, and if you read the abstract, it sounds like it's an absolute slam dunk that they link video games to violence, and then you actually read it, and it's a scattershot. I don't remember. I know with aggressive behavior, they did 4 outcomes and found statistical significance for only one of the 4. And if they had done a Bonferroni correction, they wouldn't have gotten anything. And same thing. They had some cognitive measures, they had some affective measures, and there was some were significant, some weren't, and it was just a mess. It also was just a bad study in a bunch of different ways. But even if you just sort of took the study at face value, the results were at best inconsistent. So it was weird to see like just how. I mean, I appreciate the honesty because we know there are other studies where people just don't even report the outcomes that were non-significant. So at least they were honest in reporting I presume all their outcomes, because they couldn't have gotten much worse. But it was weird to kind of like read the abstract and read how they were talking about it in the public or in news media, and then read the actual study and go like, this is like this is garbage. I mean, inconsistent studies can be valuable. I don't want to say like,
Yeah, sure.
you don't get all, but in the sense of like, you're like, this doesn't support your hypothesis. Your own study doesn't really support your hypothesis. So why are you saying it does? Or at least you should be kind of like, we found a couple things, but not a lot of things, so why are there some confusing findings there, some discrepancies?
It's more of how definitive the conclusions were.
Yeah.
Of like, here it is, and then even kind of within the study or within the methods, it was suspect in some ways. So maybe not as definitive. And that doesn't mean all of it was bad. It just some pieces of it.
Yeah, it's death by press release, as I call it. So it's what you actually did in your study and what you said you did in the press release are, or at least what you found, are quite different things.
Sure.
So I think that there was increasing awareness, and I think also there's some, I don't know if good fortune again is the right word for it, but the replication crisis started in 2011, of course, and I think that that opened a lot of people's eyes about sort of in general p-hacking and harking and all these kinds of things that lead to false positive results, and it just happened to fit very nicely with what some of us have been saying at least for 5 or 6 years before that, maybe longer. That we've been kind of saying this was going on in violent video game research even before 2011, and all of a sudden 2011 it sort of like burned through social psychology and then went on to other areas. So I think there was some, I don't know if good fortune is quite the right word for it, because it's also quite depressing that there's so much problem.
Yes, it is.
But yeah, so I think that I think people start to understand like, oh yeah, I see where this is actually quite similar to some of these other fields that also clearly have problems, and maybe this has a problem too. So some of us did start using like pre-registration and other open science techniques, and I think now there are maybe a dozen or so, maybe there's more at this point, but last I checked, which was like a year ago, it was like a dozen studies that are pre-registered, and of like the dozen, none of them found clear evidence for violent video game effects. I think one of them had some inconsistent findings. So one of the 12 or 10, 11, 12 had inconsistent results. All the other ones were all null. All nothing.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where we're at this point. That's kind of, I think, unless you really have like sunk costs in this, like some scholars do, and the APA does as well, then I think this is, pretty, it's hard to argue that if you use more rigorous methods and get nothing, that this isn't a problem for your field.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess kind of going more practical then, do you have any kind of, I don't want to say benchmark, but do you have any kind of overall kinds of ideas in terms of video games, in terms of like age or gender or certain kinds of, I guess, I don't want to say this because it sounds so universal, but any like kind of healthy norms? So like, should a 7-year-old be playing Halo for 10 hours a day? Or
at least. No, I'm not kidding.
Right. So I mean, is there something where it's like, is there a, how do we think about, okay, we can accept the fact that sure, there's not a direct link or direct cause with video game, kids playing video games or aggressive or violent video games, that they're going to necessarily do, aggressive violent acts out in the world. It may happen, that may be a factor, but it's not a 2 + 2 = 4 kind of thing. So what are your kind of, I guess, intuitions about children playing games and in terms of time, but more so I guess in terms of the violence of I mean, especially now, as I mean, we've been kind of joking about the PS5 and stuff, but some of these games are pretty realistic. I mean, they are pretty realistic. How do you just kind of think about that in terms of certain kind of cultural mores that we should have about kids playing aggressive or violent video games in general?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the main thing is that this is really like a parent's decision. That every parent is going to make a different decision, and that's their right to do it. Hopefully it's an informed decision. It might not always be, I used to work for CPS, so Child Protective Services in Texas. So I know that's not every parent is super informed, but nonetheless, it is a parent's decision. Every child is going to be different, there's no one size fits all answer,
Right.
to this sort of thing. And
Sure.
I think go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, yeah, I totally agree. I don't think it is like a one size fits all, but I don't know if there's any kind of general kinds of things about where you'd be like, I don't know if a 6-year-old should be playing, you know, Halo
Yeah.
or Call of Duty or one of these games.
Yeah, and that's a moral decision. That's a more, and
Yeah.
that's why I say like every parent is gonna like make that decision differently. I mean, I tend to agree with you. I mean, I certainly if you say like Grand Theft Auto. I mean, did I picture like a 6-year-old? I mean, I have a son, 17 now.
Right.
He can play whatever he wants at this point, but I guess 6. I wouldn't have gotten Grand Theft Auto for him, but
Right.
but that's not because I would have thought that he would have like gone on and become aggressive, or
Right.
violent
Right.
or anything. It's just
Sure.
weird. To like, I didn't want to have that conversation about what a prostitute is when he was
There's
6.
some adult themes in this.
Yeah. So it's okay to make moral choices. I'm not saying you can't make moral choices. Just be aware that you're making a moral choice, not a empirical choice, and that's fine.
Yes. Yes.
With like time spent. I mean, again, there's no like magic hours in terms of
Sure.
like if your kid plays like this many hours or more, they die. Kind of a thing, or
Right.
they live in a tent for the rest of their lives
Right.
instead of getting a job. But you want to make sure your kid's happy. You want to make sure your kid is getting their schoolwork done. If they have a part-time job, that they're keeping up with that. That they're getting adequate sleep.
Yeah.
Although in fairness, the number one killer of adolescent sleep is school, not video games. As pretty well. I mean, that's an empirical statement. That is pretty well delineated.
Yeah.
And exercise. I'm a big fan of making sure your kid gets. Even just go for a walk or something. Half an hour to an hour a day is good, as long as they kind of are balanced in that way. Then especially in the social distancing and the isolation, the epidemic, parents will sometimes ask me like, my kid's playing like 8 hours a day. Is that good? To say, well, is your kid happy? Yes. Is your kid getting the schoolwork done? Yes. Is your kid getting an hour of exercise a day? Yes. Is your kid getting 8 hours of school or sleep at school? Sleep a day? Yes. Well, where's your problem? Is your problem that your kid isn't doing well, or is the problem you?
Mm-hmm.
That you're like just you'd rather them look at trees or something. I've actually gotten that one. Like they should be outside looking at trees. It's 95 degrees. It's the summer in Florida. They're not going to stand out there and stare at trees. It's hot.
Right.
So they're going to be inside. They can't hang out with their friends. Or if they are, it's going to be on the video games. So that's the way they're going to socialize. So what are you going to have them do? To sit in the room in the dark?
Yeah.
Quote unquote, read books, which most adults don't do. Why would you think kids would do it? So anyway, yeah. So I think a lot of the problems are with the parents themselves. The kids aren't doing what they want their kids to do, but whose kids ever did at any point in history? So it wasn't video games, but it always was something else. Again, you should have like clear things are red flags when things aren't going well. So if your kid isn't happy, your kid is losing sleep more than once in a while. Like everybody binges on a video game from time to time, but if their schoolwork is sliding, those might be warning signs. It might not be the video game that did it to them, but it still might be a sign that something is going on. They may be playing video games because they're avoiding other things that are depressing them or making them anxious, but it still means there may be something to attend to. So just making sure. Basically, I'm saying is balance, but of course, what balance looks like, particularly during the COVID-19 era, is very different from what it would have looked like a year ago.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with all of that. I don't really work with kids too much, but every now and then I'll work with families or work with kind of older adolescents, and this comes up a little bit. And my thing is always the same too, is balance. I'm not going to necessarily promote 4 to 6 hours a day for video games, but you also don't want children to kind of be slaves to homework and school and chores, and you want them to be kids as well. And so I think if there's a kind of like basically what you're saying as well, if they're exercising, they're sleeping, they're riding their bike, they're outside, and then they play video games. I think it's just a kind of a balance as well. So I agree with you there. So before we switch topics, just kind of a fun question.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of your all-time favorite video games, and what have you been playing more recently, I guess, when you do play?
That's a great question. Yeah, it's like asking which of my children is my favorite. Question because I only have one, but so well, I think probably favorite games of all time. Let me see. Thinking of '80s games, I think some of my favorite old school games were like Defender. I remember playing that. I was terrible at it. Still am terrible at it. I still play it online every so often and suck. Absolutely stink at it, but I loved it. It's one of my favorite early, early games. I think games like Berserk. I always loved Berserk. And then I mentioned sort of Wizard of War, which is an
Mhm,
old
mhm,
game, which probably is a little bit more obscure. Not everybody's heard of that one, but
mhm,
it was a lot of fun that was out there. And then other things like Gauntlet, was
mhm,
also a cool game. More recent, I always liked all the D&D based games, so like the
mhm,
Gold Box games, all the way through Baldur's Gate. I'm looking forward to Baldur's Gate 3 coming out.
mhm.
Played Divinity Original Sin 2. It was really so all those kind of role playing games I tend to enjoy. Um, I like the shooter games. I don't know if anyone stands out super necessarily, other than I think of shooter games. Alice Madness Returns was always my favorite game, which
Hmm.
is it's a more obscure one.
Mhm.
It's interesting because it's got a female protagonist, and
Hmm.
it's based on the Alice Through the Looking Glass, series.
Oh,
So
cool.
instead of like an M16 or MP40 or something like that, you're shooting like pepper grinders and teacups. It's still a like it was M rated, but it's very dark gothic kind of stylistic
Yeah.
game. I really really enjoyed it. And then all the strategy games I play, of course I played all the Civilization games. I just get
Mhm,
frustrated with their AI, which is terrible. And more recently, I think my favorite ones are the Paradox games. So all of the like Europa Universalis and Hearts of
yeah.
Iron. And
Mhm.
I just it's just so talking about like not getting enough sleep. Just started playing Crusader Kings 3,
Uh-huh.
which is a beautiful game. It is
Mhm.
amazing, but of course, it is just sort of this like take over the world kind of thing. And I'm, playing as the Byzantine Empire and trying to reestablish, like the Roman Empire for,
Right,
in
right.
the 10th and 11th century. So it's been a lot of fun.
Mhm.
And too many late nights.
Yeah.
Just one more decision, and I'll go to
Yes.
bed.
I think it's so hard for me to pick favorite games. I've played a lot, since the early '90s. Um, I would say more recently, I absolutely loved Assassin's Creed Odyssey.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
love, love, love that game. I probably sunk 200 plus hours into that game. I absolutely
Mhm.
love that game. And it was one of those games where, over 6 months or so, I just like kind of became a completist with it, and I just
Yeah.
had to do everything. If there was a question mark on the map, I had to do it. It was just going to drive me nuts. Um, um, I love the Last of Us series. The second one just came out. Obviously, the first
Mhm.
one, it was really cool, just story based game. I've always been a fan of the Zelda series. Man, Breath of the Wild was so good. I got the Switch probably primarily for that game, and I mean,
Mhm.
again, I put hundreds of hours into that game just doing all that stuff, and so,
I do want to
yeah.
give a shout out too for Star Wars Squadrons was actually in VR. So I played
You're
it
like the
in VR.
third person that's told me this. I want to get it. I'm a huge Star Wars fan,
If you're
and
thinking like, oh, I don't need VR. I don't need to play the game.
yeah, it's
Wait
like
till you play
maybe I
Star
don't
Wars
need it.
Squadrons in
I don't
VR.
know,
You'll
but
never like, oh wow, you're sitting in the cockpit
I
of
know
like a TIE fighter or
I've
something.
heard this. I've heard this that Squadron and with VR. Like I mentioned earlier, I love Battlefront 2. I liked the new one that came out. Is it Fallen Order? Is that the name? Uh,
That I don't know. I haven't played that one.
there's the new one, the new story based game. But I've heard kind of like underrated. Squadron is a really good game, and I've heard that it's really good in VR. So yeah, so I usually with my daughter we play, and I mean that's not all we do together, but we definitely like playing video games, and I usually do it if I just want to kind of escape, for an hour
Yeah.
and a half or 2 hours from the week or something. I usually, plug into something and play that. So I did get they did like the remix, remaster, or whatever of the uh Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2. And oh
Mhm.
man, I mean those games were so good when they were on the original PlayStation, I think. So Yeah, so I definitely have some fun ones. Okay. Um, let's switch gears, I guess, to the next topic. So you have a new book out,
I do.
or how recent is this?
Semi-new.
Semi-new, right?
In the age of
Last year.
COVID, what counts as a new book? So it's
Right.
it was out last March, I think.
Yeah. So this is coming up on your year anniversary.
Yeah, yeah. And let me tell you, releasing a book right when a pandemic hits and all the publishing houses and distributors shut down is the best time to release a book. That's why I'm saying I don't know if it counts. I don't know when that actually was the release date.
I will say I have seen probably more now. I mean, I don't know about you. I mean, I have read more in the past year than probably ever.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been reading, I mean, probably since I was 4 years old. I used to always go to the library. I love reading. It's a favorite pastime of mine. But yeah, I just read a lot. I just read so much. But I do see a lot of other people reading a lot more, which is encouraging. And like books. I mean, I'm sure some people read on tablets. I know some people do audiobooks, but I see people like hardcover, or softcover, books, physical books. So that's always encouraging to see. So can you just kind of give the background? Like, I'm always curious about that. Like you kind of mentioned a little bit at the top, but how long did it take you to write it, and what was your main motivation? I mean, you said a little bit about it, but let me expand on it, and then we can get into some of the details.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've always, it's kind of like if I was going to live life over, I always kind of think of like, if I had my life over to, to just do all over again, start from scratch, what would I do with it? And of course, in this life, either, I don't know if I chose it or drifted into it, but I became an academic. I think like, well, and if I could do it all over again, I'd be another academic. I'll be a historian. I love history, and I love talking about history. I love all the stories, and I love this. I love the salacious like aspects of like all the war stuff, all the like terrible things people have done. So same reason I got into psychology, honestly. I sometimes joke, history is ruined by historians, because you get like people that did their PhD on the price of barley and Ireland, and how that had an impact on the salmon trade that eventually had some sort of obscure impact on the Revolutionary War. All that, like, oh God. I just want to hear about Saratoga. I don't. Sir, you may be right, but this really is not. I don't doubt at all what you're saying is true, but I just don't care, even if it is.
Right.
So tell us about like the battles, and the politics, or the cool stuff that's going on. Or the horrible stuff that's going on. I mean, maybe cool is not the right word all the time. So, I have been reading some books that had come out maybe 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. And I think like the epitome of them was this kind of, was it Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, And there have been other ones, I think, like there's one I'm going to garble the title, but it's like, how the West won and why they like won't continue to in the future or something like that. I can't remember exactly. That's not the title, but it's something.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And the thesis of these books, they're great books. I enjoy reading them. And I think that makes some fair points. And the thesis was kind of the sense of like, the West in the 15th century and thereafter kind of rose to prominence out of luck. Mostly, that it was like geography and resources that happen to have the right set of resources to expand, and the effect of like so obviously it's the plagues, the steel, those the resources, all that kind of stuff, had more impact. And so like like in like South America, where there are these otherwise Central South America, there were these major empires that developed. But they didn't have horses, and they didn't have gunpowder, and they didn't have adequate, they didn't have the wheel, other than like with little toys and stuff. So they kind of lacked it wasn't that they weren't smart. They were incredibly smart, they just didn't have the right geography, didn't have the right, scenario. And then of course, they were not, immune or sensitized to the certain diseases that we brought over when we came to the New World.
Right.
So that's kind of like their argument, which I think, is a good argument. I think that there's a lot to say that, these sort of like environmental factors have a lot of impact on history. But part of it was a sort of de-emphasis on like the great person model, right? There was literally kind of say like, individuals don't necessarily matter very much. I don't know if they would say it like at all necessarily, but they're kind of putting that as like certainly a lower emphasis than some of these other kind of like environmental and maybe cultural factors to some extent. And again, it's not that I wasn't persuaded by some aspects of what they were writing, but I did kind of think like people do still matter, and can matter, quite a bit. So, and of course, like any like historical comparison is going to be somewhat apples and oranges, but kind of thinking of like the American Revolution and the French Revolution, kind of contemporaneous, obviously somewhat different cultural factors, but one turned out, I think most of us would agree reasonably well. We're also here, whatever ups and downs the U.S. has had since, it's mostly a positive outcome. Whereas the French Revolution, wandered off and pretty quickly into chaos and, the guillotine and bloodshed and eventually Napoleon, and then ended up restoring the very monarchy that it got rid of in the first place, so it, so why did one work and the other one, and not? And I think there is a sense of, again, certainly it's apples and oranges, but also the fact is we get Washington, and Franklin and Adams and Jefferson and a bunch of other folks. We got some nutty firebrands too, but so like the people who ended up in charge were fairly level-headed individuals, and then the French get like Robespierre and eventually Napoleon, so and that mattered, right? That actually made a difference, and I think we can see that today, that like these are like compatible things, right? So we have a plague, right? And that plague is clearly having an impact on our current events, our current history, but also who we had in charge. I think most people would agree mattered. Now you might say that one side, you're gonna have some people are going to say we had the right guy in charge. Other people are going to say we had the worst guy in charge. But I think everybody's going to say that who we had in charge mattered. Whether it's positive or negative is maybe it's a bit more of a subjective choice. In 50 years, historians will render judgment on that, but right now there's probably not a consensus. But so I think there's the sense of both the individual and the sort of like environmental context can matter in shaping history. And so I was kind of interested in kind of like shifting things back a little bit to that, not saying guns, germs, and steel is wrong, but rather this stuff is important too. And just by nature is I like to write about like the negative stuff, right? So rather than talking about great people, I talked about lousy people and like the people that had, some form of, I released a book about, individuals who were major players in history and the mental health issues that they had that directed them, their behavior, and then by extension, their cultures and nations into disaster. In most cases. So it's really a book about how psychology has created disasters in history. And like I said, I really wrote it initially like this would just be a fun book to write. And maybe I think some people will, there's a few things in there that, there's it's somewhat a very special episode, right? There's a few things in there about like psychology and how we understand mental illness and the way that the mentally ill have been treated in history and all that kind of stuff. But I didn't really write it with the sense of like, this is going to be about the Trump administration and about like wokeness and like the craziness that we're involved in, today. But it just so happened that that's the contemporaneous situation that I was. So some of the latter chapters, there is some discussion of Trump, and his, what I see as some of his issues, but also some discussion of sort of polarization and left wing as well as right wing extremism. In our culture. So and that just evolved because that happened to be, I was writing it probably in 2018 and 2019. It missed 2020. I think some of my impressions of where things were going in the book were already worried, I think. And if I had been writing it still in 2020, I think that would have even been more the case. So it ended up having a bit more like, I think importance for like what's going on today than I necessarily intended it to when I first started writing it. But, that's the way things go sometimes.
And how long did it take you to write it? 2 or 3 years?
Oh, no, it wasn't that long. They didn't give me very long. I think it was an 8-month contract, actually. So I think I started writing it. Wow. With the proposal, you have to have one chapter written already. So you already have one in the can. I think it was 11 chapters total, 11 or 12, somewhere around there. So I had one in the can. Then I think they gave me 8 or 9 months to write the rest of them, which was a little grueling. I would
Yeah,
say,
that's a lot. It's
yeah,
more than
that
a
was a
chapter a
little.
month.
Yeah, it was one or two I would have to do, every month. So
That's a
that was a
lot.
bit much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the one thing I want to, all of that background is just really helpful, and it's really nice kind of to set up the book. I think the one thing that I wanted to, I guess, chat about, and I'm sure maybe other folks in our field have chatted about with you as well, is you make this interesting. I think it's important. I want to just kind of flush it out a little bit. You make this distinction between illness, or excuse me, insanity, madness, and mentally
Mhm.
ill. So maybe kind of give us your kind of just set us up for how you see those as different, because we're trying to. It is a little complicated, right? Because I think sometimes people see these things as synonymous terms, and they're not entirely. And they're all talking about different types of phenomena that are happening with different individuals.
Yeah.
And one individual could have one or two or maybe all three. Maybe you would say, I don't know how you feel about that, but so maybe kind of just, I think for people not in clinical psych, you know, would probably use these interchangeably, but there are some finer distinctions. And so maybe, and I think you talk about that at least in one chapter, and then reference it throughout other chapters. It's kind of a big staple of the book. So maybe kind of spell it out for us, the differences between the three terms.
Yeah, sure. And there's something I, try to put a lot of thought into also when kind of thinking about like what's really important, in the sense of if we're going to talk about like psychology and history, and particularly in the context of these disasters, sort of like what is it, what are the boundaries of the thing that I'm talking about here, because
Yeah.
the reality is with mental illness is a very broad category of things,
Hmm.
and that is, um, and some of the controversy, and I do talk about some of these controversies in the book, is a sense of like, obviously, mental illness is a thing that exists outside of social context. I mean, if you have schizophrenia, whether you're in the United States or Japan or in, 100 Years War era France. It still is the same thing. But that's not always the case. Whatever, so there are definitely shifting sands around sort of like what constitutes a mental illness. I mean, obviously, like, homosexuality is a great example of that. That
Hmm.
historically was considered a mental illness in the United States, and then beginning in really the 80s was
So
increasingly.
up until 1980, DSM-3,
Mhm.
I think that was when they took it out, right? Or it was in DSM. They took
I
it
think
out
it
in
was.
DSM-3, right?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I think it was DSM-3, and then they initially had it as this, like, they sort of like ratcheted it down. So they went through a couple
Yeah.
steps, and it was like initially it was just if you were homosexual, you were mentally ill, and then they ratcheted it down to if you were homosexual and unhappy about that,
Yeah.
then that became a mental. Then so and then eventually just get rid of the whole thing. I
Yeah.
think it was somewhere between the DSM-3 and DSM-3R, or the what the hell was the R?
Revised, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. There are. Yeah. So
Uh,
just for listeners, the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. It's the quote unquote Bible for uh, psychiatrists. APA puts American Psychiatric Association puts it out, but it's used by psychologists, psychiatrists, and mental health clinicians in general, those that are able to diagnose. And that's what we currently use. We are currently in DSM-5. The first one was in DSM-1 was 1954,
yeah, it was like psychoanalytic era.
and it was like almost like a psychoanalytic pamphlet.
Yeah.
And then I think it was in the 60s somewhere they came out with DSM-2, and then DSM-3 was in 1980. So there's usually a 10 to 12 year ish
Mm.
uh, 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 gap. There's a DSM-3R just to revise, and the DSM-4 was in 94. DSM-TR, which didn't really have any, DSM-4-TR didn't really have any changes in 2000.
Yeah.
And then the most recent one, DSM-5, was in
Thir-
2013. Which really, if you look at DSM-4 to DSM-5, you're talking about 20 years, which is the longest framing, or longest gap between updates, which is wild because, you know, from the early 90s until, call it 2010. I mean, that's where we had so much this explosion of research. So the fact that it took 20 years to update our diagnostic codes and our categorizations and taxonomy of diagnoses was quite long. So I don't know if they're coming out with another one sooner. I think they changed it from Roman numerals to Arabic numerals. So
They
there's
didn't
the
want to
idea.
explain that V was not for vendetta.
Right, right. So now it's DSM-5, the number 5, and with the idea that if they make a revision, it'd be 5.1, 5.2, et cetera.
Yes, whenever the American Psychiatric Association starts running out of money, they
Yeah,
decide
sounds
to
about right.
one. Yeah.
Sounds right. So okay, so you're absolutely right. With mental illness is kind of a broad umbrella. So maybe kind of walk whichever one you want. We can start with that one if you want to start with maybe madness might historically be a good starting point.
Yeah.
Maybe
So,
define that and just kind of explain it, what it looks like, and then how it's separate.
yeah. So with madness, I'm really kind of talking about the sense that someone has some kind of mental defect that is causing them to engage in destructive behavior and continues to engage in the destructive behavior despite that outcome being fairly obvious to either themselves or others, around them. So, persistence in harmful or negative behavior, essentially, is kind of looking for it, and it really kind of, it can be, various mental illnesses that are likely to do that to individuals. Although, what really kind of came out in the book. I mean, the book does cover a wide variety of people with a wide variety of issues, although a lot of them either had, chronic mental illness like schizophrenia or, cognitive impairment like Alzheimer's disease or stroke. But a lot of them had personality disorders. So, and in particular, antisocial and narcissistic and borderline personality disorders tended to get pretty highly represented
Hmm.
in the book under this sort of madness concept.
So you see, madness is a sort of kind of constellation of kind of disruptive behaviors that persist uh, through various contexts and in various domains, intra personally for somebody, which could include what we would currently see as, what we would call a comorbidity. So there's
Mhm.
a comorbidity. There's 2 disorders or 3 disorders, which are, again, disorders are just a way of, it's a classification of a series of symptoms and or phenomena that persist and have or cause significant impairment in occupational, social, academic functioning. So you would say madness is this kind of constellation, this network of kind of challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. So, with most mental illnesses, of course, people aren't necessarily destructive. I mean, you can have
Yeah.
depression and you're not harming sometimes people do harm themselves, but you don't necessarily have to harm yourself or anybody else to have the diagnosis. I mean,
Right.
caffeine dependence is in the DSM-5,
Right.
so, usually, you're not destroying anything. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'm not caffeine.
Maybe. I don't know. You ever gone without caffeine for a little bit? You get really irritable.
Yeah, but with madness, it's really the sense of like, um, you know, like causing outright, damage to
Mm.
something. Making decisions that are really going to have significant negative consequences either for oneself or for others, and keeping at it. Because
Yeah.
sometimes we might all occasionally make a bad decision
Hmm.
that is damaging, but usually we try to not do that again if we are less likely to do it again. But with some of these, some people with some of these disorders, either they're maybe they have something like schizophrenia where they just are not in a position cognitively to understand the consequences of what they're doing, and so they persist in them, or they have a personality disorder where they don't care,
Right.
or they're so impulsive or whatever else that they're not able to sort of even if they do care in the moment they can't restrain their impulses to do something destructive. So particularly in that sense, borderline personality disorder is kind of known
Hmm.
as that as
Hmm.
people who engage in self harm and other harm,
Hmm.
and may legitimately feel bad about it, but also are likely to do it again because their
Right.
ability to control those sort of emotional impulses is somewhat limited. But okay, go ahead.
I was gonna say, yeah, I just see madness as this kind of way of being unhinged, or this
Yeah.
kind of persistent and pervasive, chronic, again, constellation of symptoms, but that is basically untreated.
Mhm.
And so it just has, and it can be destructive to self or to others. Um,
And difficult to manage, really. Yeah.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
not.
and I would think the term madness, we don't use that term really so much anymore, probably for
Yeah.
politically correct reasons, or not even that. Just it's not a really good descriptor of what's going on. We have other descriptors, but historically, 18th century, 17th century, you didn't have something classified as schizophrenia. So you just said this person was mad. They were,
Yeah.
so kind of in a, there's kind of like it's almost like an antiquated term that we don't really use anymore. But the more modernized version would be this like, very complex, comorbid, untreated, persistent, pervasive,
Hmm.
um, uh, symptoms and or disorders. Does that sound about fair?
Yeah. It's just harder to put that on the cover of a book.
Yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough. Um, so, so insanity.
Yeah.
Explain this term. I remember reading it. I was like, okay, let's see how he explained, because I know how I was trained on what
Yeah.
this is, and so you explained it very well in the book. So, how do you see insanity?
Well, insanity is very much a legal term. So insanity is set by state law in the United States, and although it's usually kind of fuzzy, but
Mhm.
the exact definition is going to change from one state to another. But the basic gist of it is that a person is so impaired by either a cognitive impairment or a mental illness that they don't understand that what they're doing is illegal, or don't understand the consequences of what they are doing. And the decision about whether one is insane is either made by a jury or a judge. And an example of this would be, so if you have someone who has schizophrenia, simply having schizophrenia doesn't mean that you'll be, adjudicated as insane.
Right.
But if you have insanity and you attack someone, you assault someone, and you do so because the auditory voices in your head are telling you that that person is a communist spy who's coming to kill all of your family and you,
Right.
then you're in your mind you're acting in self-defense,
Mhm.
and you don't understand that walking across the street and stabbing them is an illegal act. For you, it isn't an illegal act. In fact, you are doing what you need to do to protect yourself and your family. So, in that sort of situation, and the case of Andrea Yates in Texas was a great example. Like, it's a woman who drowned her 5 children because she
Right.
believed they were possessed by the devil.
Right.
And that was the only way that she could save their souls, So she didn't kill them for material gain. She didn't kill them, because she
Mhm.
didn't love them, or wanted to get rid of them. She killed them because of the delusions that she was experiencing as part of her psychotic illness.
Right.
On the other hand, sometimes it's harder for people to grasp. If you have schizophrenia and you're homeless and you mug someone to get their wallet and their money,
Mhm.
we might say that obviously the schizophrenia contributed to that crime. You wouldn't have been homeless, perhaps, if you hadn't
Mhm.
had the disease. You may have had better impulse control, but nonetheless, in that case, your motive was to get the person's wallet, which was not brought on by your delusions or hallucinations. Which means, in that case, you probably would not be considered insane under the legal system, even though you have the exact same disorder. So it's a very specific set of legal circumstances that people tend to think happens all the time in the criminal justice. It really doesn't. It's actually fairly rare to see an insanity defense. It's usually not worth it for most crimes, and because you end up, the reality is you end up doing more time just in a psychiatric facility. But it does come up occasionally, and juries don't like it for the most part. So the threshold is really really high. That, like I said, you just have to show that this person would not have done this unless they had been hearing the voices in their
Mhm.
heads, whatever. So it has to be usually someone that either has schizophrenia or bipolar disorder,
Mhm.
more rarely bipolar disorder, or has a major intellectual disability, very low IQ, neurological problems that are limiting the processing of information and understanding of the world around them. So it does happen, does come up, but it's a very much more narrow set of
Mhm.
circumstances.
Mhm.
There are probably a few people in the book that we would say would probably have been able to be adjudicated as insane,
Yes.
but most of them would not have been.
Right.
Probably, they actually knew what was going on around them, knew what they were doing, but what they were doing was pretty bad.
Yeah, yeah. So I think I mentioned it on here before. Is I worked at a inpatient forensic inpatient psychiatric hospital for a couple years, and so I by the end of it, I was fairly well versed in some of the forensic elements, even though I'm not a very that's not like a strong interest for me, but one of them was we call it NGRIs, which is not guilty by reason of insanity. And pre 81, 82, whatever the Buckley Amendment was, what would happen is people would make these crime. They would have these crimes. Sometimes they would be quite heinous crimes. You're talking about some pretty grotesque things. People, killing others. People would um, assault people. It gets pretty violent. Violent sexual crimes. And in the 60s and 70s, the way to game the system was, well, you don't want to go to jail or you don't want to go to, penitentiary for life. So you just feign insanity, right?
Mhm.
You just feign that you're mentally ill. Just say, well, I heard some voices and,
Yeah.
I just, I thought that this was going to happen or some kind of delusional thinking. And the idea was, well, okay, you're just going to go spend 6 months in a, hospital somewhere and you'll be all right. You'll be fine. And what ended up happening was, once it actually was the opposite. Many folks is what they kind of colloquially would call a bad NGRI is
Mhm.
someone would plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Again, this is a forensic legal term, and they would be hospitalized and they would stay there. And when they would come up for what in different terms for this, but some version of like a forensic review board. So every 6 months or every year, they would look at the status of your mental health. And then they would say, they would look at what they would call, I think you mentioned in the book, I can't remember, dynamic and static risk factors,
Mhm.
right? And so basically what that means is what are some things that you kind of come, with parts assembled already, you as a person and then as risk factors. And then what are some things that are a product of your environment that could make you more um, uh, prone to certain things on top of mental illness. And so if someone was at a risk for um, committing certain violent crimes, then they would not let this person out into society, into the community, because that's, obviously a liability to the society and to the community, and then obviously to practitioners in the hospital, et cetera. And then to the patient themselves. And so what ended up happening in many of these situations is that, folks that, did some type of crime, it wouldn't even have to be a violent crime. It's some kind of crime, plead guilty, not reasoned by insanity, 40 years, going on 50 years later, they're still in these inpatient hospitals because they're deemed a risk.
Yeah.
And it probably would have been better to, do 3 or 5 years in jail, and then you would have been out.
Yeah.
Um, in that from that framework. So then there was the I think it's the Buckley Amendment, right? Is that what I'm right on this? Which basically stated that you couldn't. There was stricter parameters around who could file
Yeah.
not guilty by reason of insanity. Insanity. So I guess in somewhere in the 80s. This is obviously a famous case with Reagan and Hinckley and everything. So that's not, you don't see that happen really anymore. Um, and so kind of to your point, the insanity, yes, as a legal term, that's very rare. That rarely gets used. A lot of people don't like it anymore. And I think I would have to say that probably some of that has to do with this history of, everyone was getting NGRI'd, in the 70s. And they're like, no, maybe not so much anymore. Along with, at the time, late 60s or, in the 70s, I have some actually strong opinions about this, but there was this push to have what we call de-institutionalization. So it's like, well, we don't want to be a warehouse of just warehousing people that are mentally ill. They need to learn how to live in the community and have community, services, social workers and therapy and med management, outpatient, et cetera, so they can, live in society. And some of that is fair because the treatment of these individuals in forensic hospitals or just inpatient hospitals around the country was pretty abusive, I would
Sure.
say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so there was that push, and then there was the political government push. The problem is that all those folks are basically the homeless that live on the street.
Right.
Most, I think it's over 80%. Maybe I'm wrong in the numbers, but I know it's over 50% for sure of people in most major urban cities have pretty serious mental illness that are homeless. And so this isn't just, I mean, this obviously does happen. The guy that lost his job and now he's on the street, that's actually less common now. What's
Mhm.
more common is folks that are um, seriously mentally ill and they don't have the cognitive capacity, They don't have the activities of daily living skills that they need to do things. They don't have medication compliance. They don't have any mental health treatment. And so they are basically just kind of floundering in society, and they're homeless, which is, quite sad and a big problem. So anyway, sorry, I went on a rant there. But
Yeah.
so anyways, insanity is less commonly used. So
Yeah.
then we have the bigger umbrella, which you already kind of mentioned, which is mental illness. So how do you? I mean, it's a big umbrella. How do you kind of define it or see it?
I kind of like the joke I have about it is read the DSM-5. If you find yourself described in there, then you have a mental illness. I mean, it's, like I said, it's the Bible. It's the American Psychiatric Association's it's also their major cash cow, which is why I made the joke about them whenever they don't have money. But I mean, it's really they theoretically, based on research, I say theoretically because there have been some criticisms of the DSM-5 in particular.
Right.
Look for good research in order to try to define what the boundaries are of normal versus abnormal behavior,
Right.
and then delineate it in this book in order to try to guide psychologists and psychiatrists to make good diagnoses, and of course it's used for reimbursement and such. But I mean, the way I used to hear it referred to is I think the criteria was a deviance, maladaptiveness, and distress, were like the three big criteria. If you And then the way I kind of thought of them is and I think there's less evidence on deviance now for a variety of reasons, but the old school version of that was if your behavior was weird enough that the average person in your community would remark upon it as being strange, then you would hit that one. Again, I think we've now gotten so broad that we allow people to do a lot of things that even 20 years ago would have been considered sort of unusual. So that one's, I think, being de-emphasized. But maladaptive is going to sound a lot like what I described as madness, which is that persistence in a behavior despite it causing negative consequences. Although those could be fairly minor. Not like destroying a nation, but smoking, would be a good example of maladaptive behavior. So nicotine dependence, not surprisingly, is in the DSM. And then distress. You're not happy. You're angry. You're depressed. You're anxious, or have some other significant mood-related issue that's causing problems for you. So the trick is, of course, okay, those all sound good, but where some of the stuff is kind of normal. We all sometimes do stuff that's maladaptive. We all do stuff that's deviant. And of course, we all have distress. From time. So where are the boundaries between when that's sort of normal and when it isn't? So with schizophrenia, I think it's pretty obvious. This is way over. A person has a psychotic illness, is hearing voices and having delusions, and is unable to speak in coherent sentences and stuff. Is pretty clearly beyond that line. But with other things like how much anxiety do you need to have before it becomes a mental illness, as opposed to a normal reaction to having stress, which is humans are supposed to feel anxious when they're under stress. That was controversial with the bereavement diagnosis, right? So historically in the DSM-4, if you had what would be considered a major depressive episode, you were sad almost all day, almost every day for 2 weeks or more, but your mom died, that would be considered, your mom died. I mean, so it's sort of normal to feel that way. And they changed that in the DSM-5, or at least that's my understanding, is they made it such that now it actually is diagnosable. So that's where sometimes there are some criticisms around this, and I think they did it I think their heart was in the right place. They're trying to get more people access to treatment, which is fair. But there is this kind of question of is it maybe people would be happy if they had someone to talk to, or even had access to an SSRI or something about antidepressant. But is it a mental illness exactly? If if someone you're close to, doesn't have to be your parent, but your spouse, your child dies, and 2 weeks later you're feeling sad every day. I think that'd be pretty normal. But so that's where sometimes there's these questions about where the boundaries are between mental illness and just kind of normal reactions to bad events. But yeah, so it is a super broad category in that, like I said, it's everything from caffeine dependence all the way up through schizophrenia. So it's really kind of hard to say here's the conceptual boundaries of where all these things fit. And it includes Alzheimer's disease. It includes intellectual disabilities, what used to be called mental retardation. It includes personality disorders, which are their own separate category of things. They used to be considered fairly different from mental illnesses in the DSM-4, but they kind of changed that too.
Hmm.
So it's a broad space, and it's really kind of hard to say like these are the boundaries. If you're on this side of the boundary, you've got one. If you're on the other side of the boundary, you don't. And the reality is that my impression and a lot of the criticism of the DSM-5 in particular, as opposed to the DSM-4, actually, which is interesting, is that the sort of like the reliability even of clinician ratings using the new criteria has been lower than was desired. So there's still a lot of subjectivity in sense of like when someone meets a diagnosis or not. And the general gist is a lot of these concepts have broadened over time. So I would say, maybe you disagree with me, but I would say it's much easier to get diagnosed with ADHD today than it was 30 years ago. And even autism spectrum disorders, I think, have gotten a little bit more easy to, which could be good or not. It could be maybe more people are getting, access to services as a consequence. Not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but what we're considering to be a mental illness versus someone who's just unusual or different, I think is changing over time.
Yeah. So, yeah, I have a few ideas about that. So, you know, I don't really like. So I have like a very, I mean, I guess you could say, hypocritical view of this, or contradictory view of this, rather. Um, I don't really think in labels. I mean, I don't know. I've been doing this for a long time, so I just don't. When I see someone, I don't think like bipolar. I don't really think that. I mean, I see the symptoms, but I don't. I see a person, right?
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, like I love differential diagnosis.
Hmm.
I think it's a lot of fun. It's
Yeah.
really. I still enjoy the kind of scratching your head around, like, wow, where does this is an interesting presentation. Um, when I teach this class, clinical diagnosis, I always tell students, look, you have to know this, you have to know it very well. Um, obviously you see the humanity in people, so you don't just see a label, you don't see a diagnosis, but you have to know this well because there is a difference in what we understand as these things. So, for example, if you diagnose somebody as major depressive disorder, but they really have bipolar, but you've just never seen the mania, and you give someone you recommend someone, you say, major depressive disorder, and they see, PA, or a physician, a psychiatrist, and they say, oh, okay, depressive disorder, boom, here you go, here's the lithium. I mean, they could kill themselves. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that's and lithium is a kind of the common medication for bipolar. And
Yeah.
so it's really important to know distinctions.
Yeah.
Sometimes it becomes, some of the fun differentials are, is this schizoaffective bipolar type, or is this bipolar one with, psychotic features? Like, that's so granular.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, in terms of what you were saying with autism, I know when this was coming out, people were really upset about, because again, just this is kind of in the weeds, but the DSM went from an axle system. So there was an
Yeah.
axis 1 through 5, which was basically axis 1 was clinical disorders, axis 2 was personality disorders, axis 3 was health disorders, um, axis 4 was kind of psychosocial factors. And then there was a general, what's the GAF score? General assessment of
Assessment
functioning,
functioning. Yeah.
which is basically just a number system, just kind of put like, where, how much impairment is this causing. And they took that out, which had been the case since DSM-3. So we're talking,
Mhm.
up to that point, 30 years. So, then they put in all these disorders as a multidimensional or in a continuum, I think, which not only theoretically, but conceptually, that probably makes more sense.
Mhm.
But with autism, that was really tough. So that's why there's no more Asperger's, and that's why
Yeah.
there's autism level 1, 2, and 3. With ADHD, I hear what you're saying about that. But I think that in terms, I mean, the criteria for ADHD hasn't really changed. I always tell folks that ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. And so you don't want people, even if it has less stigma, you shouldn't want people to be diagnosed with a
Mm.
neurodevelopmental disorder, for one.
Yeah.
For two, I always tell people that it's, you need, the 6 symptoms for hyperactivity impulsive type, or predominantly inattentive type, or 6 and 6 each for combined presentation. But it always has to be in two settings. And I think people forget that. Oh, he's not paying attention. He's not focusing in school, ADHD. And it's like, well, how is he at home? How is he in church or community or with his friends, or, in other settings? And like, it's fine.
Yeah.
Well, he probably doesn't have ADHD. He could have a learning disability, which is another neurodevelopmental disorder. He could have um, other things going on. He'd be depressed. I mean, there's other things that could be going on. So what I usually tell students is you got to look at symptoms, because symptoms of uh, psychomotor agitation, difficulty concentrating, fatigue, increased, decreased appetite, increased, decreased sleep, those symptoms are in like 10 disorders.
Yeah.
So just someone presents in front of you as, well, doc, I'm not eating, I'm not sleeping, and I just can't focus. That could be anxiety, depression, mania, ADHD. I mean, it could be literally, like, half a dozen disorders. And so it's important to kind of look at, the symptoms. And again, I tell students, you could have 10 people in a room that all have bipolar 1 disorder, and it's going to present differently. So even with the labels, even with mental health or mental illness, it's important to understand nuance. And again, that's, I think, what the overarching piece of it is. We have to see the person, right? We have to see their humanity. We have to understand their context. We have to understand their, kind of how they're experiencing things. So it is, it is complicated. The one I dislike, I would say, in DSM-5, everyone kind of dislikes something. And there's people that disliked how they organize the neurocognitive disorders. They disliked, how they did autism. The one that always kind of bugged me was the disruptive mood dysregulation disorder that they put in the depressive category, just because there wasn't really any research. It was just a new label created to reduce pediatric bipolar diagnoses or whatever. And it's just, I don't know. I still don't really like it. And it's you have to have it between, after age 6, but before age 10, and not after 18. It's just like, it's so weird. It's such a weird disorder. So, and the differential with that between that disorder and oppositional defiant is like, the hardest thing ever to differentiate. It's just like, this is, and there's a difference, right? One are impulse control disorders and one's a depressive disorder. So conceptually, it's like, it's kind of important. So I don't know. That was always I always used to pick on that one.
Well, antisocial personality disorder was kind of weird like that too, right? You had to be age 18 in order to be diagnosed with it, and it's really, though, if I remember correctly, it's really the personality disorders that has that little loophole in it. And before 18, it's like conduct disorder, right? Which is pretty much the same thing.
What it is, in terms largely, which is interesting because you're going from a clinical one to a personality disorder. That's one piece, I guess, in the old Axel system. But then also there's more. It is more likely that if you have what we call childhood onset conduct disorder, it is really likely that you're going to be, you have antisocial personality disorder, essentially a sociopath. This is people like, dismembering, cats and birds and stuff like that as a kid, it's, then childhood onset, I think it's under the age of 10, I believe. So anyway, so then kind of going to that, then there's so personality disorders fit also under mental illness in an interesting way. We won't have to forge into that very complicated labyrinth of mental illness. But what's not in the DSM and what's not technically, I don't know if you might disagree on this, mental illness per se, is what we understand as psychopathy and sociopathy, which are actually interchangeable terms. I think the more official term that is used is sociopathy, I believe. I might be wrong on that. And
depends on which field you're in. If you're in sociopathy, yes.
And I think for us, it's psychopathy, but but there's essentially synonymous. People are talking about the same thing. And how does that fit in? Because that's on the DSM. That's not seen necessarily as mental illness. Folks that have antisocial personality disorder doesn't necessarily mean that there's psychopaths. Although that is, folks that we understand as psychopaths do many times have antisocial, but it's not required. how does that kind of fit in? And that will kind of lead us to the kind of these major figures throughout in the book that you talk about, because there's a lot of this stuff. So how do you factor that in here?
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion around that space. I mean, so yeah, I mean, there was kind of like a history of these terms, and the first one, if I remember correctly, was like psychopath was the first one that was initially used, and I was going back to like really the early versions of DSM. I think even did use the term psychopath, if I remember correctly, and I think what some people didn't like about it was that it sort of had this implication that it had like a biological origin to it, somewhat. That you were born into it. And then, so like the 60s and 70s came and everybody started thinking, I don't know, there was a big hostility to any kind of biological cause for human behavior, to any theories that mention that. So that's why it all of a sudden became sociopathy. And it's really they're the same thing, in terms of, I mean, you will find people who make an argument for like some sort of like, minutia difference between what a psychopath and sociopath. But you're getting so far down into like the non-empirical weeds by that point that there's not really, I don't think, a great empirical case to be made for any kind of major distinction. But yeah, what people liked about sociopath was a sense of, this was now due to the environment, so that had become trendy for a while to think that, so I think even, we mentioned Silence of the Lambs. I mean, I think there's even that quote in there that talked about like, serial killers are made, not born, right? Through, years and years of systematic abuse. I think something like I can't do movie quotes. And I certainly can't do Anthony Hopkins' voice. So it wasn't so much that like the concept changed, but the way people thought about how it, like the ideology, the origin of it kind of changed, is what was trendy. And then eventually, and I think it was like the DSM-3, they really kind of tried to de-emphasize any kind of theoretical causality, and so they came up with this sort of more neutral term of antisocial personality disorder, which in some ways is actually really a bad name because it makes it sound like are like like super shy or something.
That would be avoidant personality.
Yes, that would be a totally different personality disorder.
Right. People will use that colloquially. Like, you're just antisocial. I'm like, I don't think that's what you mean, but I know it's a tricky one.
Yeah, I guess it's excuse me, but yeah, I don't know what they were thinking, but they're all basically, in terms of like, as far as like official clinical diagnoses are, they're the same thing, and antisocial is the official name for it. Now, that did not make some people happy, and so you have like Robert Hare is really the big guy who's known in the psychopathy literature. Is they're all Canadians that do this stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So his argument, and again, he would probably put it a lot better than I could, but I've read his books and his articles and stuff. But I think his argument essentially, like, there's a pretty big overlap between the two concepts. But like psychopathy is there's not the word that he would choose, I'm sure, but it's like more hardcore than antisocial. So most people with psychopathy is his preferred term is psychopathy, and his adherence, and I'm fine with it. I don't have a big dog in this.
Me neither.
So he would argue that like psychopaths are all antisocial, but not all antisocials are psychopaths, kind of thing. Yeah. Right. And so it's really like the people who are more prone to, get involved in criminal behavior or other like highly unethical behavior, So like, some people with antisocial personality disorder, many people with antisocial personality disorder function fine in society. They're just not, huggy, squeezy people that feel like a lot of emotion or empathy. Right. But they might make excellent, frontline combat troops or business people or lawyers or, all kinds of, plenty of professions that you can do very well with that personality style. Whereas psychopaths are less likely to find those kind of like pro-social avenues, for that lack of empathy and such. And so the basic argument is around against like the conceptual space for it, and then also psychopathy again, even from like Hare's model, tends to emphasize a lot more of the biology, and so the idea that there are like frontal lobe deficits that are involved in low stimulation, low empathy, that kind of stuff, and that they're more genetic. It's everything that the Silence of the Lambs said wasn't true. Basically, that right. It's actually you are born with it, or at least with the propensity for it. It's not all genetic, or nothing is all genetic, of course, but or at least very few. I guess Huntington's disease is all genetic, but very few things are. So I think it's emphasize that, but in the sense of like you sometimes will hear even college students, will say like, I'm not a psychopath, I'm a sociopath or whatever. But, I don't. Neither one's good, But also, I'm not sure that there's like a big distinction between these things. Like, yeah, I think if you go on the web, you'll find like plenty of like web articles that will make it.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
but I don't think there's anything in terms of like great empirical literature that will support the idea. And then there is another thing that's called sadistic personality disorder, which Theodore Milan was the guy who is I don't know if he's still alive, but he is or was a well-known personality researcher, and he argues that is again sort of a subtype of antisocial personality disorder, where with antisocial you just tend to have like low empathy, you may be a bit more hedonistic and that kind of stuff, but you're not like really out to like destroy the world, but you might not care if you do, but it's not really your goal. Whereas with sadistic, it is the goal, to do harm. And
I think with that is also not only to do harm, but to also gain pleasure from doing harm.
Correct.
I think it's the key, or how I understand the key distinction there. Which I think it was him, right? It was his scales, the MCMI, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Which is up to 4 now, right? And 4 came out a couple years ago.
Is it? Yeah, I knew it was 3rd.
I used 3 forever, but I think 4 came out recently.
I think you're right. Yeah.
So how do we? So okay, so I'll beat you up on this a little bit.
Go for it.
So I was reading the book, and you were talking about some of these characters. So I think the first chapter early on, you talk about Bundy, who is always one of the most fascinating serial killers to me. He's very interesting. And I think you definitely talk about somewhere in there King George III. I think you mentioned Sula, right? You talk about a bunch of these, Napoleon. But if I remember correctly, when I was reading is that you'll mention, so not definitively, not absolutely, but very much like based on what we understand from history and their presentation, they would probably have something modern terms this kind of disorder or this type of pathology, which I always like start getting real nervous when folks do that. Like, oh no, oh no, there's giving current mental disorders for historical figures and or political figures. I personally don't do that, even though I've had plenty of people ask me like, "What do you think this person's blah blah blah?" And I'm like, "Nah, not going to do that." So I guess so at first I was like, "Oh no, Chris, what are you doing? Don't not like this." And then I think it's somewhere in the book, I don't remember where, you give that explanation of, technically, I think might be for American Psychiatric Association. They kind of tell psychiatrists you're not allowed to officially or even kind of unofficially diagnose people that aren't technically your patient. And while that doesn't apply, I don't think, for psychologists, it's kind of best practice to also not do that. So I was a little bit happier, but at first I was like, kind of white knuckling my chair. I was like, no. So I saw the point of, I think, why you were doing it, just to try and kind of contextualize it in the modern era. But so I didn't know if you wanted to, chat about that or your reasons for doing some of that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's absolutely fine. Yeah. No, and of course, in the book I do talk about, like, especially if you're going to like go back, hundreds or even thousands of years, if we're kind of like look at like Caligula, right? And we're going to talk about like what is going on with Caligula, and there are these sort of speculations that he may have had a brain infection that worsened some of the, we obviously don't have his body. We actually, we can't like autopsy him and find out, what his body is lost to history entirely. And so, I do make that point that this is speculative. We're going to do the best we can, and with what evidence we have from history, and knowing, 2 things. One, the other thing, and you didn't even mention it, was historians in the past. Well, historians in the present do this too. Is lie. So we don't necessarily know how accurate all the information is. And I talk about that with a lot of the cases about like, they said he did this, but I don't know if that's true. And sometimes you can look to see like if different sources kind of say the same thing or if they don't, and that can kind of give you a little bit of a clue if there's some consistency there. So there's that aspect, and of course, sometimes you just can't get like the biological evidence that you would like to, particularly if it's more of like a biological disorder, like Alzheimer's disease or
Mhm.
brain infection or something of that sort. So yeah, I mean, I tried to throw some asterisks onto the diagnoses and say
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
like, look, this is just for this is an interesting intellectual exercise.
Hmm.
I'm not saying definitively. This is what and in some cases, like George III, there really are these differential diagnoses that have popped up in the literature, whether it's, porphyria or did he have bipolar disorder or something of that sort. Like I say, like, here's a bunch of articles that says he has this, and here's a bunch of articles that says he has that, and I think it's probably more this one than that one, but I don't know, so
Hmm.
I did try to hedge my bets a little bit,
Hmm.
with that. But yeah, especially with like the more like modern political figures, like we talk about Trump, for
Hmm.
instance, and he does show up in the book.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, so there are now at this point like two countervailing ways of thinking, and one is the Goldwater rule, which is what you refer to, which
Right.
is the American Psychiatric Association. Um, Psychologists are not bound by it, but I think just in fact, for the book, I asked the APA kind of where they stood in
Oh.
these things, and they
Wow.
said, well, they said, they're not bound by it, just like don't go crazy. I don't. They put it better than that, but that was kind of like their advice is,
Right. 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 Right.
I think it was like be clear about like the boundaries of
Hmm.
what evidence you're producing and why you're making the decision you are, and just be clear that you haven't done like a psychological assessment.
Right.
And I think I have those notes I think I've
Hmm.
made it clear
Hmm.
that I had not done
Yeah.
a psychological assessment with Trump or anything.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And with that, yeah, so there is an argument, especially, and it's gotten more power in the Trump years, of this sort of sense of like, well, people can be at least provisionally diagnosed, by
Hmm.
their public behavior. So again, as long as you put those asterisks in there, you can sort of say like, here's what they did in public, and here's how they behaved in the public sphere, and at least in the context of saying like, in terms of like things like fitness for office, for instance, that you could say like, here's how they behaved in a public realm, and this is consistent with this thing. And people, if that is accurate, then these people who have this thing make good or lousy leaders, and such. So I think it's something you can do as long as you do put those asterisks on there. Now, if I were to say, from my read of history from 2000 years ago, I know that Caligula had a brain infection and that exacerbated his pre-existing propensities towards violence and like that, then I think that would be silly, but
Yeah.
that's why
Yeah.
I did try to say like, I mean, I don't know exactly how I put it, but I think I said like, here's all the things, here's the evidence we got. We need to know that this is going to be preliminary to say the least, and this is going to be, as much an intellectual exercise as it is a truth, and we can't say definitively that Caligula had a brain infection and that brain infection worsened his
Hmm.
situations, but based on the evidence we have, it is the most consistent path to suggest that this may have been what happened. We would love to have more information that would back that up, but we have to be accepting of the fact that we can never really be sure. So I think that's kind of how I tried to at least split that needle a little bit, or thread that needle, mixing my metaphors here, I think. And to say like, yeah, I think, I don't know if I came out and said like, hey, we're just going to do this for fun, but that was also kind of like an element
Yeah.
of it is like, we just, as long as we know that this is not definitive, that we can still do this and enjoy it a little bit, and maybe learn from it, a little bit, but also be humble. I think I did use the word humble in there.
Yeah. No. 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 No, you definitely explained it at some point. And I said, "Oh, okay. I feel better now." I was like, "Okay, yeah, no, I wanted that kind of explanation." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, I got it. I got what I wanted." Um, I just say the thing with Trump. Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, it could be a variety of things. I mean, maybe it's some type of a frontotemporal dementia, early onset. Maybe it is, a narcissistic personality kind of thing. We could all speculate these things. I guess my problem with the public presentation, especially with someone like Trump, is I still believe a good percentage of that stuff is a show.
Mm-hmm.
It's so hard for me personally when I look at public behavior to know, like, if this person came, like, let's just take aside for a minute, completely blind, this person, I don't know who Ted Cruz is. I don't know who Donald Trump is. I don't know who, any of these folks are. And, Bill Clinton. I don't know who any of they are. And they come into my office and they sit down and then, I do like a assessment and, a clinical interview and all these things. I'm sure I would get a very different description or descriptive analysis of their behavior. And if I do collateral information of just them privately. And
Mhm.
so I think publicly is so there's so much like, oil in the water there. It's so hard to know like, okay, is this a show? If for Trump, is he really doing 4D chess? It it is hard to know based just off of that. Um, I think maybe for some people we can maybe know that. I mean, I'm pretty sure. I mean, he's basically said that. I mean, publicly now that Kanye West has bipolar 1 disorder.
Yeah,
And
sure.
I'm pretty confident of that, mostly because he said that. He's talked about it publicly. And, that TMZ episode was like a manic episode. I mean, that's literally what a manic episode looks like. So, that stuff is maybe a little bit more, accurate. But I don't know. I think with public figures, it just in general is really hard. I'll give it. You mentioned in the book, and I actually went back to the notes to look at it. And it is the same book. You mentioned Abraham Lincoln, and people have done this. There's that book, Lincoln's Melancholy, by is it Shake. I think it's Joshua Shake. I think it's the guy's name, where he writes on this. And I think he kind of says something along those lines, like probably would be major depressive disorder or something like that. I think with Lincoln, I think it's hard
Mm.
actually because I think just kind of as his temperament was probably just kind of a melancholy guy.
Yeah,
Um,
he was low key, that's for sure. Yeah.
and he had deep, deep suffering. I mean, lost his mother, lost his sister, lost his stepmom, lost his kids. I mean, lost the first person he loved. I mean, too much. I mean, that's just, I mean, kind of salient for the time, but he just had a lot of loss by like 21. Um, and so it's like, well, yeah, no shit. I probably feel kind of depressed too if I people close to me.
Yeah.
Yikes. So, but again, I wouldn't put a diagnosis, but I think for if there was one, I don't think it would be major depressive disorder. I think you probably have like what we call a persistent depressive disorder, kind of the old
Yeah.
dysthymia. He
Mhm.
just kind of that, just kind of or it could just be kind of a melancholy, just in general, as a temperament thing. Which again, I think is these things are so hard to know based just off public lifespan or
Yeah.
public sphere and things like that. Um,
I think with things like with Lincoln, and I think with some of the other ones too. I think they do look at their like letters and all that kind of stuff too.
mhm,
So
mhm.
you get some, if you have that pool of evidence available, you can start to cobble together some more bits of data from some of that
Mhm.
as well, which can help. So, but I think with all these things, we are of course limited to whatever data pieces we've got, and have to do the best we can to kind of make some judgments, from those pieces of evidence. And like I said, I think the best thing we can do with our readership or our audience or whatever is just to express that humility and saying like, look, the margin of error here is going to be wider than it would be if I was able to bring them in, to my office and do an MMPI.
Right. Right.
With that, I can't do that.
Right. Right.
I'm not satisfied with the idea that we can never say anything about them ever.
Yeah.
At the same
Yeah.
time, so we need to somehow find the right balance, I think, between saying nothing about these individuals versus, like I said, being overly conclusive based on a more limited pool of data than we might,
Mhm.
ideally like. You know,
So it's two questions like on this topic here is so the first thing, or not the first thing, but one of them is you kind of said in the beginning that the whole it's kind of like a fun book to write, which it definitely was fun to read. I really enjoyed it. Um, but it which was yeah, environment and disease and the cultural changes and all this stuff through time. But kind of the main thesis, which is yeah, but there was some pretty fucking terrible people too that were governing their kingdom or their state or their country or so that society or whatever. And let's not consider that. Let's not minimize that. If you want to call it, again, this is where the terms become actually pretty important. I typically hate semantic arguments just because it gets like no one ever really agrees. But I think it does. That's where your explanation of, insanity, madness, mental illness, et cetera, is important, where it's just like, look, there were some folks that were um, at the time not so well.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't know maybe that they weren't so something was off. And so again, kind of your idea of like, this is important too, this has impact too. So kind of that, and then also with like bridging that with, I guess sometimes people do this with history of like, well, what can we learn from that and make sure that in like people in our modern era, like current day, where we don't do that, where it doesn't happen, and and or why are we choosing sometimes now these kind of cartoon caricature strong men to lead our countries or lead our states? And so I guess just kind of in summation, like, how do you see kind of the thread that you took for the book? How do you see that apply for lessons for today, or how we should take seriously people that we put in power or in governance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to make clear. I mean, we've been kind of talking about Trump, a little bit, and in the book, I don't necessarily put all the blame, or even maybe more than half of it, onto Trump or Trumpism and such. I mean, I think we have problems with right and left, maybe not in equal measure, because then people get into like, oh, you're saying it's both sides. But either side likes both sideserism. That's what I also find. Both sides hates both sideserism. It doesn't have to be 50-50. If it's 60-40, 70-30, it's still bad. Both sides are contributing it, even if it's not in equal amounts. It's still not a good thing. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff, with populism, whether it's coming from like the right or the left, or, so what we're seeing in like the United States, and I think we're seeing in other countries too, like, the United Kingdom and even places like Germany and such to a lesser degree, but certainly like
Brazil and Philippines, and there's a lot of different places and even different versions of the left. I mean, where it's, more extreme at various countries in South America or Latin America, excuse me. Have that version. So yeah, I mean, it is a both sides thing.
It is. It's interesting. I mean, if you look at, this is of course like Steven Pinker's argument a lot. If you look at like most like economic or violence or health indicators cross nationally, that the 21st century is about the best time, even if you're in the lowest, most impoverished places or individuals, lowest classes or whatever.
Absolutely.
That this is the best time to be alive. That doesn't mean there aren't iniquities, there aren't
right.
Problems that aren't serious. Obviously there are hot spots in the world like Syria right now that that have major issues. There's slavery in China. There's all kinds of big things. So I'm not trying to downplay that.
Right.
But this is really like pretty much the best time. Pick a time before 1970 you'd rather have lived in. And you'll
right.
find that on just like any of these indices, things will be much worse. Pick any year in the 14th century that you would rather live in than 2020, and
no thanks. No thanks.
Yes, there's not a single year.
Disease probably is going to get us all first. If not, then it's going to be someone raping and pillaging a town or something like that. So yeah, no thanks.
So the interesting thing is like, so I mean, if you take like, one of the big issues over the summer was of course like, race relations and all that kind of stuff with, so if you actually look at like the history of over just the last like 10 to 15 years, that race relations in the 2000s were actually pretty good, so majorities of both white and black, Americans were relatively happy, it wasn't everybody, right. But there was general sense of like race relations was getting better. And that started dropping around 2014 until we get to the present day where, of course, majorities are unhappy at this point. And so the question becomes is why? Like, what happened? If you look at the actual data, most things got better. They're not. I'm not saying there's no iniquities, there's no problems, whatever. But if you look at like police shootings, for instance, police shootings declined
yes.
During that, and they're actually of unarmed individuals, they're fairly rare. If you look at like economic issues, they got better. They're not, necessarily where we want them to be, but they were improving. So why was this sort of downslide happening at the same time as things were mostly getting better? And it seems like for some reason, like it just like in general, like the social fabric is kind of unwinding a little bit, and people are just like angry with each other about stuff they don't really know, even if it's like why, or at least they're misinformed about why they are angry. And again, it's not to say that if you're an out of work coal miner in Appalachia on one hand, or if you're an inner city person of color and you feel like you're not getting the education you deserve compared to other people, it's not to say that nobody has any reason to complain. But it's fascinating to watch this sort of like complete disintegration of and it's not just that like lower income individuals are complaining about high income individuals. I mean, a lot of it's happening between groups of high income individuals that are screaming at each other because they each voted for the wrong candidate. And so like what? And this is cross nationally. I mean, the U.S. might have it better than some places and worse than others. So the question becomes is, why, some of this stuff is happening. And like I said, there's a lot of misinformation on both the left and the right about, these things that perceived crises that really aren't, necessarily as big a crisis at very least as people, seem to think that they are. And that's a complicated question, but it seems like in general, people kind of feel like they're losing control over their vision of what society should be. And unfortunately, this is happening to both sides at the same time, and they're blaming each other, for doing that. And a lot of the incentive structures that are sort of developing in society now are against compromise and are for this sense of essentially win at all costs. So that, when the Republicans came into power under Trump, it's like, we're going to do our stuff. And we're not going to worry about what the Democrats like. In fact, it's a feature, not a bug, if Democrats don't like it. Yeah. And now, Biden came in under the sort of guise of unity, and that lasted about 25 seconds. And now it's pretty much the same thing. If the Republicans don't like what we're doing, that's a feature, not a bug. And so how do you get... And that's what the incentive structure is for politicians. That's what the incentive structure is for, I'd say even academics to some extent, is to side with one of these sides and not the other one. So how do we change that incentive structure and get people to recognize that, yes, there are problems, we should work on those problems together, but the world's not that bad. I mean, that's not to say that, again, it's all peaches and cream, but it's, let's be realistic and be data focused. Right. Instead of thinking like, everything's going to fall apart, tomorrow. But that's really kind of the tricky thing is like, how did we get to this sort of position of everybody just being so angry all the time and that being virtuous? That's really the problem is that the angrier you are, the more virtuous you see on your side. Yes. Those of us who say like, I'm actually kind of a little nervous. I say like, things aren't that bad. I just keep putting in a lot of asterisks. Like, they're bad in some places. Not bad at all. But it's actually dangerous to say like, things aren't that bad. I understand that I might be coming from a place where, I have things better than a lot of people do. I totally get that. But I mean, I'm just talking data-wise, historically. You just like look back from 10 years ago, things are better, and certainly if you look back 100 years or 200 years ago, things are much, much better. And I think we have to have that, long view without necessarily using that then to say, well, we're not going to do anything about our problems today. We should do things about our problems today, but we should do so based on the data and based on, being civil, being rational and that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Well, Chris, you've been super generous with your time. This is so much fun. It's everything I wanted and more. So I'm super glad we got to talk and you got to share all of your wonderful knowledge and insights. And so tell folks where they can find you.
Awesome. Yeah. So I have a website. It's not very original. It's just my name. So it's Christopher J. Ferguson, FERGUSON.com. So you can look me up there. I've got all my research stuff is posted there, and I write a little bit of fiction, and so you can find some of that in there too. Cool. And if you are interested in grabbing up a copy of the book, How Madness Shaped History, it's available on all the major booksellers like Amazon and Barnes and Noble. So help put my kid through college, and
it's a great book. Everyone should get it. It's a really great book. It's well written. It's pretty accessible. It's great. Well, Chris, thank you. And I will hope to have you on here again sometime soon.
That'd be fantastic. This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Likewise. All right, man.
All right.